The grand piano sat untouched in the corner of Le Chateau, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Expensive perfume, quiet laughter, and the gentle clink of silverware on fine china filled the air. Between tables moved a young woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile, balancing plates with the precision that comes from years of practice. May had been working at Le Chateau for almost 3 years now. The upscale Manhattan restaurant catered to people who thought nothing of spending more on a bottle of wine than she made in 2 weeks. Tonight was especially busy. A mixture of Wall Street executives, fashion industry elites, and old money families filled every table. To them, she was practically invisible, a necessary part of their dining experience, but not someone worthy of genuine acknowledgement. "Excuse me, miss. This steak is overcooked," a man in an expensive suit called out without looking up from his phone. "Take it back." "Of course, sir. I'm very sorry about that." May carefully removed the barely touched plate. The steak looked perfectly medium rare to her trained eye, exactly as he had ordered it, but she knew better than to comment. The kitchen would make him a new one, and the barely touched food would go to waste. As she pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, the head chef, Antoine, looked up. "Let me guess. Mr. Table 12 wants another steak?" May nodded. "Third time this month." "Some people just like to flex their power," Antoine sighed, already reaching for a fresh cut of meat. "You okay tonight?" "You look more tired than usual." May forced a smile. "Double shift. Rent's due next week." What she didn't say was that her grandmother's medical bills had arrived yesterday, another crushing reminder of why she was here instead of where she'd once dreamed of being. 3 years ago, she'd been halfway through her second year at Juilliard, when her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died, had suffered a stroke. The choice had been simple but heartbreaking: drop out to work full-time or watch the only family she had left drown in debt. "You should take a break when the rush slows down," Antoine said, his voice gentler than his usual kitchen commands. 10 minutes. I'll cover for you." May smiled gratefully. Antoine was one of the few people at Le Chateau who treated the waitstaff like human beings. He'd started as a dishwasher 20 years ago and hadn't forgotten what it was like on the bottom rung. 2 hours later, the main dinner service was winding down. The restaurant wouldn't close for another 3 hours, but there was a lull as early diners left and late reservations hadn't yet arrived. May's feet ached in her mandatory black heels and her lower back throbbed from hours of carrying heavy trays. "Go take that break," Antoine called out as she delivered a dessert order. "Kitchen's slow. Now's your chance." May slipped into the small staff lounge at the back of the restaurant and sank onto the worn couch. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of quiet. The lounge had a small window that faced an alley, and through it she could hear a street musician playing saxophone. The melody was familiar, a jazz standard her grandmother used to hum while cooking. Without thinking, her fingers began to move on her lap, playing invisible keys. Even after 3 years away from regular practice, her muscle memory remained intact. Her hands knew Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Liszt, composers whose work had once been the center of her existence. "I didn't know you played." May's eyes snapped open. Lena, one of the newer waitresses, stood in the doorway watching her with curiosity. "I don't," May said quickly. "Not anymore." "Your fingers were moving like you were playing Bach," Lena persisted. "That was the prelude in C major, wasn't it?" May stared at her, surprised. "You know classical music?" "Music education major before I dropped out," Lena shrugged. "Money problems. But I still recognize a trained pianist when I see one." May felt suddenly exposed, as if Lena had accidentally walked in on her changing clothes, rather than simply observing her hands. Her musical background wasn't exactly a secret, but it wasn't something she talked about either. It hurt too much to discuss what might have been. "I studied at Juilliard for almost 2 years, May admitted quietly. It was the first time she'd said those words aloud in the restaurant. Lena's eyes widened. "Juilliard? That's... wow. What are you doing waiting tables?" "Life happened," May said simply. "Family emergency, bills piled up." "You know how it goes. Do you still play at all?" May shook her head. "My apartment has paper-thin walls and no space for even an upright. And anyway, what would be the point?" She glanced at her watch and stood up. "Break's over. We should get back." As they walked through the dimly lit hallway that connected the staff areas to the main restaurant, they passed the grand piano. It was a Steinway Model D, a concert grand worth more than everything May owned combined. The owner had purchased it as a status symbol more than anything else. On weekends, they hired a pianist to provide background music, but on weekdays like today, it sat silent, more decoration than instrument. May paused for just a moment as they passed it. The lid was closed, protecting the keys that she knew would feel like old friends under her fingers. Sometimes, during slow afternoons when the restaurant was nearly empty, she would dust it with extra care, occasionally letting her hands rest on the closed lid longer than necessary. "You should play it sometime," Lena whispered. Noticing her lingering gaze, May shook her head. "And risk my job?" "No thanks. Why would you risk your job? The restaurant has a pianist on weekends. That's different. They're hired to be seen and heard. I'm hired to be neither." May adjusted her black serving apron. "Besides, that part of my life is over." Back on the floor, the restaurant was beginning to fill again with the late dinner crowd. This group was even more extravagant than the early diners. Women dripped with diamonds, men wore watches that cost more than May's yearly salary. A famous actress sat in the corner booth, surrounded by an entourage determined to keep all other patrons at bay. May was assigned to a table of financial executives celebrating a successful merger. They ordered $500 bottles of wine without glancing at the price and spoke loudly about their vacation homes and private jets. One of them snapped his fingers to get her attention, and another referred to her as sweetheart when ordering his third martini. As she served their appetizers, she overheard one man commenting on the piano. "Steinway Model D, same as Carnegie Hall uses. Bet they paid a fortune for it." "Waste of money if you ask me," his colleague replied. "The weekend pianist they hire can barely play chopsticks." May bit her tongue. The weekend pianist, an older gentleman named Harold, was actually quite talented, but the restaurant instructed him to play simple, unobtrusive background music. She'd spoken with him once about his classical training in Vienna, and he'd confessed that playing elevator music for people who didn't listen was soul-crushing. But it paid well. "Excuse me," one of the executives called out as she turned to leave. "Do you know if anyone's playing that thing tonight?" "No, sir," May replied politely. "We only have piano music on weekends." "Shame," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't actually care. "My daughter's learning piano. Terrible at it. Can't understand why my wife insists on the lessons." May nodded politely and escaped to the kitchen. As she pushed through the doors, she nearly collided with Mr. Reynolds, the restaurant manager, who was in the middle of an agitated phone call. "What do you mean you've got food poisoning? The Wilsons' charity event is tomorrow night. We've advertised live piano music." He paused, listening to the person on the other end. Fine, get better. I'll figure something out." He hung up and rubbed his temples, noticing May for the first time. "Problem with tomorrow's event." "Harold's sick. The charity gala?" May asked. The Wilsons were regulars who rented out the entire restaurant once a year for their foundation's fundraiser. It was always the biggest night of the year, with celebrities, politicians, and business moguls in attendance. "Yes, and now we have no pianist." "On our biggest night." Mr. Reynolds looked stressed. "I'll have to call some agencies tomorrow, see if they can send someone on short notice." "It'll cost a fortune." May hesitated. For a wild moment she considered offering to play, but fear stopped her. It had been 3 years since she'd performed for anyone. Her skills had surely deteriorated, and revealing her background might raise questions about why someone with Juilliard training was waiting tables. "I'm sure you'll find someone, sir," she said instead, and hurried back to the dining room where her table was impatiently waiting for their main courses. As she moved through the evening, taking orders, delivering food, and forcing smiles, May found her gaze repeatedly drawn to the piano. Tomorrow night someone new would sit at that bench, fingers dancing across those keys, creating something beautiful that half the audience would ignore. And she would be carrying trays and taking orders just like every other night, her own fingers remembering melodies they were no longer allowed to play. The morning of the charity gala arrived with a flurry of activity at Le Chateau. May had been called in 4 hours early to help with preparations. The entire restaurant had been transformed overnight. Fresh flowers adorned every surface. The lighting had been adjusted to a warm, flattering glow, and a small stage had been set up near the piano for speeches later in the evening. "Did Mr. Reynolds find a replacement pianist?" May asked Lena as they folded the specially ordered napkins into elaborate shapes. Lena shook her head. Not yet. He's been making calls all morning, but apparently there's some big orchestra event tonight. Everyone's booked. May felt a twinge of anxiety on her boss's behalf. The Wilsons' charity gala wasn't just important for them, it was crucial for the restaurant. The exposure and connections made during this annual event kept Le Chateau booked solid for months afterward. No pianist meant unhappy clients, which meant potential disaster for everyone who depended on this place for their livelihood. By afternoon, the tension in the air was palpable. Kitchen staff hurried to prepare the specialized menu. Bartenders stocked the rare liquors that had been ordered specifically for tonight, and Mr. Reynolds paced the floor, his phone permanently attached to his ear as he tried agency after agency. Nothing, he finally announced to the staff gathered for the pre-event meeting. Absolutely nothing. Every pianist in New York seems to be booked tonight. What about recorded music? Suggested one of the bartenders. Mr. Reynolds shook his head. Mrs. Wilson specifically requested live piano music. She wants that refined atmosphere for her donors. He sighed heavily. We'll have to make do. The event will go on, just without music. The staff dispersed to their assignments, but May lingered behind, watching as Mr. Reynolds stared dejectedly at the grand piano. She knew how important this night was, not just for the restaurant but for him personally. Reynolds had worked his way up from maitre d' to manager over 15 years. The success of events like this directly reflected on his performance. May took a deep breath. Mr. Reynolds? He turned, seeming surprised to see her still there. Yes, May? The word stuck in her throat. What was she thinking? She hadn't performed in 3 years. Her hands probably wouldn't even remember how to play properly anymore. And yet, I might be able to help, she said quietly. With the piano, I mean. He stared at her. You play? I used to. I studied at Juilliard before I had to drop out. His eyebrows shot up. Juilliard? You're serious? May nodded, already regretting her impulsive offer. It's been a few years since I played regularly, but I know most of the classical repertoire that would be appropriate for this kind of event. Reynolds looked at her with new eyes, as if suddenly seeing a completely different person standing before him. Why didn't you ever mention this? Mee shrugged, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. It wasn't relevant to serving tables. He glanced at his watch, then back at the piano, clearly weighing his limited options. Can you play something for me? No. May's heart began to race. This was happening too fast. She'd imagined maybe having a few hours to practice, to reacquaint herself with the feeling of keys beneath her fingers. But Reynolds was already walking toward the piano, lifting the lid, revealing the gleaming keys that suddenly seemed both inviting and terrifying. Just a short piece, he urged when he saw her hesitation. Anything to give me an idea of your skill level. May slowly approached the piano, aware that her hands were shaking. She sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly out of habit. The keys felt cool beneath her fingertips as she positioned her hands. What should she play? Something simple to ease back in, or something impressive to convince Reynolds? Her mind raced through her repertoire, settling finally on Debussy's Clair de Lune. Beautiful but not overly technical. Something that would showcase musicality over flashy fingerwork. She took a deep breath and began to play. The first few notes came hesitantly, her fingers stiff from years of disuse. But as the familiar melody began to flow, something awakened inside her. Muscle memory took over, and suddenly the years fell away. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind had tried to forget. The joy of creating music, the freedom of expression she'd once lived for. As the final notes faded, she realized her cheeks were wet. She quickly wiped away the tears before turning to face her boss. Reynolds was staring at her, mouth slightly open. That was... He seemed at a loss for words. It wasn't very good, May said, embarrassed. I'm out of practice. My timing was off in the middle section and I missed. It was beautiful, he interrupted. Honestly, it was far better than what we usually have here on weekends. He checked his watch again. The event starts in 3 hours. Do you think you could put together enough pieces to play background music during the cocktail hour and dinner? Nothing too complex, just like what you just played. Relief and anxiety battled within her. Part of her, the part that had been dormant for 3 years, was desperate to say yes, to feel the keys beneath her fingers again, to lose herself in music if only for one night. The other part, The practical survivor who had locked away dreams that hurt too much screamed caution. "I can try," she finally said, "but I can't promise it will be perfect. Perfect isn't necessary. Presentable is." Reynolds nodded decisively. It's settled then. "You'll play tonight." He paused, seeming to realize something. "But what about your serving duties?" "I can adjust the staff schedule," came a voice from behind them. Antoine the chef had apparently been listening from the kitchen doorway. "May's section can be covered by splitting it between Lena and Paolo. They're both experienced enough to handle the extra tables." Reynolds considered this, then nodded. "Fine, May, take the next 2 hours to practice. We'll have someone bring you water and a light meal. I want you fresh and ready by 6 o'clock. As he walked away, Antoine approached her with a smile. "I always knew there was something different about you. The way you hum while setting tables, it's too precise, too musical." He gestured toward the piano. "This is where you belong, not carrying trays." May shook her head. "This is just for tonight. Tomorrow I'll be back to serving." Antoine gave her a knowing look but didn't argue. "I'll have the kitchen prepare something special for you. Artists need proper fuel." Alone with the piano, May felt a mixture of excitement and terror. What had she gotten herself into? She hadn't performed in public since her last recital at Juilliard 3 years ago. Even then, she'd been playing for an audience of fellow musicians and instructors, people who understood and appreciated classical music. Tonight she would be background noise for wealthy patrons who probably wouldn't even listen. Just think of it as practice, she told herself, flexing her fingers. No one's going to be paying attention anyway. She began to work through pieces she had once known by heart: Chopin Nocturne, Mozart sonatas, Debussy preludes. Some came back easily, flowing from her fingers as if she'd never stopped playing. Others were frustratingly elusive, requiring several attempts before the muscle memory returned. By the time Lena brought her a plate of food, May had compiled a mental list of about 15 pieces she felt confident enough to play. "Everyone's talking about you," Lena said, setting down the plate. "Word's spreading that we have a Juilliard pianist on staff." May grimaced. "Great, more pressure." "No pressure," Lena insisted. "They're excited. I think half the kitchen staff is planning to find excuses to come out and listen to you tonight." "They'll be disappointed," May said, flexing her sore fingers. "I'm nowhere near the level I was at school." "Stop that," Lena said firmly. "I heard you playing just now. You're incredible." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then added quietly, "This could be your way back in, you know. Rich people with connections will be everywhere tonight. Who knows who might hear you play?" May shook her head. "I'm not looking for a way back in. That dream is over. This is just helping out in an emergency." Lena looked skeptical but didn't push further. "Well, whatever you're calling it, you should eat something. Chef made you his special risotto, the one he usually reserves for food critics." As the hour of the gala approached, the staff changed into their formal serving attire. May, however, was presented with a different outfit, a simple but elegant black dress that had been hastily purchased from a nearby department store. "You can't play piano in a server's uniform," Reynolds explained. "This should fit. We guessed your size." The dress was actually quite nice, if a bit loose in places. May changed quickly in the staff bathroom, then stared at her reflection. With her hair pulled back and the elegant dress, she looked like a different person, like the concert pianist she might have become in another life. As the first guests began to arrive, May took her place at the piano, hidden partially by a large floral arrangement. Her instructions were to play softly, creating atmosphere without demanding attention, background music as unobtrusive as possible. She began with a gentle Mozart sonata, keeping her touch light and her tempo moderate. As the room slowly filled with glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos, she transitioned smoothly between pieces, watching the crowd from her partially concealed position. The Wilsons arrived, a distinguished older couple who moved through the room like royalty, greeting their guests with practiced charm. Behind them came celebrities May had only seen in magazines, politicians whose faces appeared on the news, and business leaders whose companies controlled vast portions of the economy. These were people who could change lives with a single decision, people whose casual dinner conversations might involve sums of money that May couldn't imagine. And here she was providing the soundtrack to their evening, invisible as always, but in a completely different way. As the cocktail hour progressed, May noticed something unexpected. A few guests had paused near the piano, listening with what appeared to be genuine interest. One woman in particular, an elegant lady with silver hair, had been standing nearby for several minutes, her eyes closed as May played through a Chopin nocturne. When May finished the piece, the woman opened her eyes and gave her a small appreciative nod before moving away. That simple acknowledgement from someone who had actually listened sent a warm glow through May's chest. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of the joy that music had once given her. Maybe tonight wouldn't be so bad after all. Dinner service began at 8 o'clock sharp. May had been playing for nearly 2 hours, cycling through her repertoire of classical pieces while keeping them soft and unobtrusive. Her fingers were beginning to tire. Years without regular practice had weakened the specific muscles needed for extended piano playing. But there was also an exhilaration building inside her, a forgotten joy that grew with each piece she played. Mr. Reynolds approached the piano during a brief pause between songs. "You're doing wonderfully," he said quietly. "Mrs. Wilson actually asked me who you were. Said the music selection was divine." May blinked in surprise. She noticed? More than noticed. She's quite impressed. He glanced back at the crowded dining room. "Listen, we're about to serve the main course. Take a 15-minute break, rest your hands, have some water. Then I'd like you to play something more." "More?" May asked, confused. "More noticeable," Reynolds clarified. "After the main course and before dessert, Mrs. Wilson will give a short speech about the charity. Once she's done, I want you to play something that will catch their attention. Not background music, something impressive." Anxiety fluttered in May's chest. "I've been keeping it simple because that's what you asked for." "I'm not sure if I'm ready to—" "You are," Reynolds said firmly. "I heard you practicing earlier. That piece with all the fast parts, what was it? Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2? "Yes, that one. Play that after Mrs. Wilson's speech." May shook her head. "That's an incredibly difficult piece. I haven't played it in years. I was just messing around with parts of it earlier, not playing the whole thing." Reynolds looked at her intently. "Listen, May, I've been in this business for 20 years. I know when someone has a gift, you do. Don't waste it playing elevator music when you could be truly heard." Before she could protest further, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd of wealthy diners. May sat frozen on the bench, heart pounding. The Hungarian Rhapsody was a showstopper, a piece designed to showcase technical brilliance and emotional range. It wasn't something you played as background music at a dinner party. It was something you performed on a concert stage. During her break, May escaped to the small staff bathroom. Her reflection showed flushed cheeks and bright eyes. She barely recognized herself in the elegant black dress with her hair pinned up. For a moment, she looked like the concert pianist she had once dreamed of becoming. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection. "It's just one piece." But as she returned to the piano, doubt crept in. What if she failed spectacularly? What if her fingers fumbled and she embarrassed herself in front of all these important people? Worse, what if she embarrassed the restaurant and cost people their jobs? She resumed playing her gentle background selections, trying to focus on the music rather than her growing anxiety. The main course was served, a delicate sea bass with seasonal vegetables, one of Antoine's signature dishes. The dining room hummed with conversation and the clink of silverware on fine china. May watched as Mrs. Wilson, an elegant woman in her 60s wearing a stunning emerald gown, rose from her seat at the center table. A staff member handed her a microphone, and the room gradually quieted. "Good evening, friends and supporters," Mrs. Wilson began with practiced charm. "Thank you all for joining us for another year of giving. Before we indulge in Chef Antoine's famous chocolate soufflé, I wanted to take a moment to remind us all why we're here." She spoke about the Foundation's work providing musical education to underprivileged children throughout New York, how they had established programs in schools where arts funding had been cut, how they provided instruments and lessons to talented kids who could never afford them otherwise. "Music changed my life as a young girl," Mrs. Wilson continued. "I was fortunate enough to have parents who could provide me with lessons and opportunities. But talent doesn't discriminate based on zip code or family income. There are brilliant young musicians in every neighborhood of this city, and it's our responsibility to ensure they get the chance to develop their gifts." May felt a lump forming in her throat. How different might her life have been if a foundation like this had existed when her grandmother fell ill? Could she have found a way to continue her education with financial support? Last year, Mrs. Wilson continued, your generous donations helped 57 children receive instruments and lessons. This year, we aim to double that number. So please enjoy your dessert and remember, every dollar donated tonight goes directly to putting instruments in eager young hands. Applause filled the room as Mrs. Wilson returned to her seat. Staff began moving toward the kitchen to bring out the dessert course, and May knew her moment had arrived. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned them over the keys. The list piece was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious after 3 years away from serious practice. But something about Mrs. Wilson's speech had touched a nerve. All those children getting the opportunity she had lost, it felt right somehow to play this piece for them, even if they weren't present. She took a deep breath and began to play. The Hungarian Rhapsody starts deceptively simply, a somber, almost melancholy introduction that gives little hint of the pyrotechnics to come. May played these opening bars with deliberate restraint, letting her fingers reacquaint themselves with the familiar patterns. As the piece progressed, she remained intensely focused on the keys, afraid to look up and see if anyone was listening. The middle section arrived faster, more technically demanding. Her fingers stumbled once, hitting an awkward wrong note, but she pushed forward, refusing to let one mistake derail her. Then came the Friska, the fast, fiery finale that made this piece famous. Rapid octaves, lightning-fast scale passages, hands crossing over each other in a choreography that required absolute precision. 3 years ago, she would have played this section with confidence born of daily practice. Now she simply surrendered to the music, letting muscle memory guide her. Lost in concentration, May didn't immediately notice the change in the room. It wasn't until she reached a brief pause in the music that she became aware of the silence. Complete, utter silence. No clinking glasses, no conversation, no movement of servers or diners. She glanced up, momentarily disoriented. Every person in the restaurant was watching her. Servers stood frozen with trays of dessert. Diners had put down their forks and wine glasses. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to cluster around the doorway, Antoine at the front with arms crossed and a proud smile on his face. For a split second, panic threatened to overtake her. All these eyes, all this attention, it was overwhelming after years of deliberate invisibility. But the music pulled her back in, demanding completion. She returned her focus to the keys and launched into the final section of the piece. Her hands flew across the keyboard, muscle memory fully awakened now. The thunderous chords and dazzling runs poured out of her as if the 3-year gap had never existed. In this moment, she wasn't a waitress playing beyond her station. She was exactly who she had trained to be, a musician giving voice to one of the most thrilling pieces in the classical repertoire. As she struck the final chords with all the drama and flair they demanded, the room remained suspended in silence for one breathless moment. Then it erupted. Applause crashed over her like a wave, startling in its intensity. People were standing. Someone whistled, a distinctly un-gala-like sound that nonetheless seemed perfectly appropriate in the moment. May sat stunned, her hands still resting on the keys, her breath coming in short gasps from the exertion. She hadn't played like that in years, hadn't let herself feel the pure joy of surrendering completely to music, of letting it flow through her without restraint or apology. Mrs. Wilson was the first to approach the piano, her eyes bright with something that looked like recognition. "My dear," she said, her voice carrying despite the continuing applause. "That was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary." "Thank you," May managed, her voice barely audible. "You studied at a conservatory, clearly," Mrs. Wilson continued. "Your technique is too refined for anything less." May nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. "Juilliard. For almost 2 years." Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "And now you're playing at charity events? Whose student were you?" "Professor Abramovich." The older woman's eyes widened. "Dmitri Abramovich? He only takes the most promising students." She studied May more closely. "What's your name, dear?" "Machen." A flash of recognition crossed Mrs. Wilson's face. "Chen. Wait, weren't you the one who won the Young Artists competition about 4 years ago? Playing Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto?" May stared at her in shock. "You remember that? I'm on the board at Juilliard, my dear. I make it my business to remember exceptional talent." Mrs. Wilson looked puzzled. "But you disappeared." Abramovich was devastated. He said you had the potential to be one of the greats. The crowd around the piano had grown. Other guests were listening to their conversation with undisguised interest. Mr. Reynolds hovered nearby, looking both stunned and delighted by this unexpected turn of events. My grandmother got sick, May explained, feeling strangely detached as if she were talking about someone else's life. She raised me after my parents died. There was no money for her care and my tuition. I had to choose. Mrs. Wilson's expression softened. And you chose family, as many would. She turned to her husband, who had joined her by the piano. Robert, we found our performer for next month's foundation gala at Lincoln Center. Mr. Wilson, a distinguished man with salt and pepper hair, nodded in agreement. Absolutely. If she's available, of course, May's mind spun. Lincoln Center? The same venue where she had once dreamed of performing as a professional pianist? I don't think, she began. We pay our performers properly, Mrs. Wilson interrupted, correctly guessing the source of May's hesitation. $5,000 for the evening. And if you're as good as I think you are, there will be people in that audience who can help restart what was interrupted. $5,000. That would cover her grandmother's medical bills for months. It would give May breathing room she hadn't had in years. A tall, distinguished man pushed his way gently through the crowd. Excuse me, he said, extending his hand to May. Thomas Blackwood, director of the New York Philharmonic. That was quite remarkable, Ms. Chen. I'd very much like to speak with you after the event, if you have a moment. May took his hand automatically, too overwhelmed to fully process what was happening. The director of the Philharmonic wanted to speak with her? After one impulsive performance on a restaurant piano? As more people pressed forward, eager to meet the unexpected talent who had emerged from behind the scenes, May caught sight of Lena standing near the kitchen doors. Her colleague gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up and mouthed the words, "I told you so." In that moment, surrounded by people who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible, May felt both terrified and strangely at peace. Something had awakened that she had tried desperately to keep dormant, not just her musical ability but her identity as a musician. For 3 years, she had been surviving. Perhaps now, finally, she could begin living again. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for May. After her performance, she was no longer invisible. Quite the opposite. It seemed everyone at the gala wanted to speak with her, congratulate her, or press business cards into her hand with urgent requests to call me tomorrow. Dessert service had been delayed by nearly 20 minutes as guests clustered around the piano, asking questions about her background and training. Mr. Reynolds, seeing the crowd's enthusiasm, had quickly adapted, instructing the staff to circulate with champagne while the impromptu meet and greet continued. I knew you were something special, Mrs. Wilson said warmly, still standing by the piano while others took their turns speaking with May. But I had no idea we had a genuine prodigy serving our dinners. I'm hardly a prodigy, May protested. I just worked very hard for many years. Modesty too, Mrs. Wilson said with an approving nod. Robert, make sure Thomas has her contact information for the Lincoln Center event. The director of the Philharmonic, who had been waiting patiently nearby, stepped forward again. Ms. Chen, I don't want to overwhelm you, but I'm serious about that conversation. The Philharmonic has a young artists program that might interest you. Full scholarship, stipend included. We're always looking for exceptional talent. May's hands gripped the piano bench tightly. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in real life. Waitresses didn't suddenly get discovered and offered scholarships to prestigious programs. Yet the business card he placed on the piano was undeniably real. Heavy cardstock with embossed lettering. I'll need to think about it, she managed to say. This is all very unexpected. He nodded understandingly. Of course, but don't think too long. Our selection committee meets next week. Eventually, Mr. Reynolds gently intervened, announcing that dessert was ready to be served. The crowd reluctantly dispersed back to their tables, though many continued to glance in May's direction throughout the final course. Would you mind playing something soft again while they finish dessert? Reynolds asked. Nothing like before, just gentle background music. May nodded, grateful for the familiar task. Playing quietly required less emotional energy than making conversation with all these powerful strangers, who suddenly saw her as someone worth knowing. As she played a gentle Chopin nocturne, she noticed Antoine watching her from the kitchen doorway. When their eyes met, he gave her a knowing smile and a small bow, a gesture of respect from one artist to another. Lena, passing by with a tray of coffee cups, whispered, "You're amazing," without breaking stride. By the time the last guest departed just after midnight, May felt physically and emotionally drained. Her fingers ached from hours of playing, and her mind was still trying to process everything that had happened. The staff gathered in the main dining room for their usual post-event meeting. Reynolds, looking happier than May had ever seen him, held up his hands for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hosted some successful events in this restaurant, but nothing like tonight." He beamed at the tired but satisfied staff. "The Wilsons are thrilled. The guests can't stop talking about the hidden virtuoso we've been keeping in our midst, and Mrs. Wilson has already booked us for next year's gala." A cheer went up from the exhausted servers and kitchen staff. Reynolds held up his hand again. "And speaking of our hidden virtuoso," he turned to May with a broad smile, "I think we need to talk about your future here. Come see me tomorrow afternoon. I have a proposition for you." As the meeting broke up and staff began the final cleanup, May was surrounded by colleagues who had worked alongside her for years without ever knowing about her musical background. There were questions, congratulations, and not a small amount of good-natured teasing. "All this time we've been working with a secret genius," one of the bartenders joked. "No wonder you always hummed the fancy classical stuff while rolling silverware." "You should have seen these rich folks' faces," Lena added, mimicking an expression of shocked surprise. "When you hit those super-fast parts, I thought Mrs. Vandermeer was going to fall right out of her chair." May smiled tiredly. "I made plenty of mistakes. I'm really out of practice and nobody noticed," Lena assured her. They were too busy having their minds blown. After changing back into her regular clothes, May finally left the restaurant at nearly 1 in the morning. The night air was cool against her flushed skin. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the starless New York sky, letting the reality of the evening sink in. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her grandmother. "How was your night, little sparrow? Did you play well?" May's heart contracted. She had called her grandmother earlier in the day when Reynolds first asked her to fill in, too excited and nervous to keep it to herself. Her grandmother, who had sacrificed so much for May's education and had been heartbroken when she dropped out of Juilliard, had been more excited than anyone. "Better than I expected," May typed back. "People liked it." "A lot," 3 dots appeared then. "I'm so proud of you. I always knew you would find your way back to music. It's in your blood." Tears pricked May's eyes. In her blood. Yes, that's how it had felt tonight. Like the music had never left her, had just been patiently waiting for her return. Another message appeared. "When can I hear you play?" "It's been too long." "Soon," May promised. "Very soon." The next afternoon, May arrived at Le Chateau for her meeting with Reynolds. The restaurant was closed on Mondays, so the dining room was empty and quiet, chairs stacked on tables while the cleaning crew mopped the floors. Reynolds was waiting in his small office off the main dining room. He smiled as she entered, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I've had 17 calls this morning," he said without preamble. 17 calls from people who were at the gala last night asking about you." May shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "About me?" "About the brilliant pianist we have on staff. Several have asked if you're available for private events. Mrs. Wilson called personally to confirm you'll be playing at the Lincoln Center Gala, and Mr. Blackwood from the Philharmonic wanted to make sure I passed along his sincere interest in meeting with you this week." The reality was still difficult to grasp. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been just another waitress in an upscale restaurant. Now people were calling about her? "I'm not sure what to do with all this," she admitted. Reynolds leaned forward. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I have a proposal." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "We've been wanting to expand our live music offerings beyond just the weekend pianist. What would you think about becoming our house pianist 4 nights a week? We'd start you at 3 times your current salary plus tips." May's mouth fell open. 3 times? Reynolds nodded. "You'd play Thursday through Sunday evenings. No more carrying trays or taking orders. Just playing that beautiful piano and doing what you were clearly born to do." It was a generous offer. Far more money than she was making as a server, and without the physical toll on her body. But something held her back from accepting immediately. "What about the Philharmonic opportunity?" she asked. "And Mrs. Wilson's Lincoln Center event?" You could still do those, Reynolds assured her. We'd work around any special performances or training. Think of this as your home base while you rebuild your career, a steady income while you explore those other opportunities. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. But a small voice in the back of May's mind whispered that perhaps she was meant for something more, something closer to the dream she had, reluctantly abandoned 3 years ago. Can I have a few days to think about it? She asked. This is all happening so fast. Of course, Reynolds said. Take the week. But May, he looked at her seriously. Don't sell yourself short. What I heard last night wasn't just good enough for a restaurant gig. It was exceptional. As May left Reynolds' office, she found Antoine waiting for her in the dining room. The chef was dressed in street clothes rather than his usual whites, making him look somehow smaller, more human. I heard about Reynolds' offer, he said. News travels fast around here. May smiled. Were you eavesdropping at the door? Maybe a little, Antoine admitted with a grin. It's a good offer. But is it good enough? What do you mean? Antoine gestured for her to sit at one of the tables that had already been cleaned. He took the seat across from her. I've worked in restaurants for 30 years, he said. Started as a dishwasher in Paris when I was 16. Worked my way up to executive chef. I'm good at what I do, very good. But I'm not a genius. He looked at her intently. You are. What you did last night, that wasn't just skill. That was something special. I'm not. May began to protest. You are, Antoine interrupted firmly. I know talent when I see it. You think I haven't heard pianists before? My cousin was a concert pianist in France. I grew up going to his performances. What you have is rare. Don't waste it playing background music for people who aren't really listening, no matter how good the money is. May sighed. My grandmother needs care. Her medical bills, and there are other ways, Antoine said. This Philharmonic program, they mentioned a stipend, yes? And scholarships? And Mrs. Wilson seems ready to adopt you as her personal project. Rich people love to support young artists. It makes them feel important. I don't want to be anyone's charity case, May said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. Antoine laughed. Is that what's holding you back, pride? Look at you, working double shifts, destroying your back and feet carrying trays, all to pay bills. And now you're too proud to accept help that could change your life? Put that way, it did sound foolish. Still, the idea of becoming dependent on patrons, on their goodwill and continued interest was uncomfortable. What if it doesn't work out? She asked quietly. What if I take this chance and fail? At least here I know where I stand. Antoine studied her for a moment. You know what the worst mistake I ever made was? 20 years ago, I was offered the chance to open my own restaurant in Paris. Investors, everything lined up. But I was afraid. I had a good job, steady pay. Why risk it? So I said no. He shook his head. I've regretted it every day since. He reached across the table and patted her hand. Don't be me, May. Don't choose safety over your gift. The restaurant will always be here if you need to come back. As she left Le Chateau, May's phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. Ms. Chen, this is Thomas Blackwood from the NY Philharmonic. I hope you don't mind. Mrs. Wilson shared your contact information. Are you available to meet tomorrow? I'd like to discuss your future. May stopped on the sidewalk, staring at the message. Her future, after 3 years of simply surviving day to day, the idea of having a future, a musical future, was almost too much to comprehend. With trembling fingers, she typed her reply. Yes, I'd like that very much. 1 year later, May stood backstage at Le Chateau, listening to the hum of conversation from the packed dining room. The restaurant had been transformed for the evening, tables rearranged to create a small performance space around the grand piano, lighting adjusted to create the intimate atmosphere of a concert hall rather than a dining establishment. A gentle hand touched her shoulder. She turned to find Mrs. Wilson smiling at her, elegant as always in a midnight blue evening gown. Nervous? Mrs. Wilson asked. May nodded. A little. It's different coming back here as a performer rather than staff. You've played far bigger venues this year, Mrs. Wilson reminded her. Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, that European tour with the chamber orchestra. I know, but this place, it's where everything changed. May smoothed down the simple black dress she had chosen for tonight's performance. Not the hastily purchased one from a year ago, but a custom-designed piece from a designer who had approached her after a recent performance. The past year had been a whirlwind of change. The day after the Wilsons' gala, May had met with Thomas Blackwood and been accepted into the Philharmonic's Young Artist Program on a full scholarship with a generous living stipend. Mrs. Wilson had not only hired her for the Lincoln Center benefit but had also become something of a mentor, introducing May to influential people in New York's classical music scene. Most importantly, 3 months into her renewed musical career, May had been able to move her grandmother into a better care facility with full-time medical support. She had even been able to buy a small upright piano for her apartment, where she now practiced daily. The restaurant manager, Mr. Reynolds, appeared at her elbow. 5 minutes, May, we're packed out there. Every table booked weeks in advance. Thanks to your marketing, May said with a smile. Former Waitress returns as concert pianist was a stroke of genius. Reynolds chuckled. I didn't have to embellish the story, it sold itself. He squeezed her arm encouragingly. The staff are all excited to see you. Antoine prepared something special for after your performance. As Reynolds moved away to oversee final preparations, Mrs. Wilson gave May a thoughtful look. You know, when I first heard you play, I knew you were extraordinary, but I don't think even I realized how quickly you would rise. Blackwood tells me they're considering you for a solo with the Philharmonic next season. May nodded, still amazed by this development herself. It's been suggested. Nothing's finalized yet. It will be, Mrs. Wilson said with the confidence of someone used to being right. You've worked incredibly hard this past year. Your professor at Juilliard says you've made up for the lost years in record time. Returning to Juilliard had been one of May's first decisions after joining the Philharmonic program. Professor Abramovich had welcomed her back with open arms and tears in his eyes, setting up an accelerated program to help her complete her degree while maintaining her performance schedule. I still can't believe sometimes that this is my life now, May admitted. A year ago I was carrying trays and worrying about tips, and now you worry about tempo and interpretation instead, Mrs. Wilson said with a gentle smile. Much better worries to have, don't you think? A staff member appeared, signaling that it was time. Mrs. Wilson squeezed May's hand. Go show them how far you've come. As May walked into the dining room, a hush fell over the crowd. The faces looking back at her were different from the usual Le Chateau clientele. Yes, there were wealthy patrons in expensive clothes, but mixed among them were music students with more modest attire who had snatched up tickets the moment they went on sale. In the back, she spotted the entire kitchen staff, including Antoine, who had insisted on cooking tonight despite having been promoted to executive chef for the restaurant group's new location. Near the front, in a specially reserved table, sat her grandmother in a wheelchair, looking frail but proud, her eyes bright with anticipation. Beside her was Lena, who had become a close friend over the past year and often visited May's grandmother when May was traveling for performances. May took her seat at the piano, the same Steinway she had played a year ago, though now it had been professionally maintained and tuned specifically for tonight's performance. She adjusted the bench, took a deep breath, and looked out at the audience. Thank you all for coming tonight, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. This performance means a great deal to me. 1 year ago, I stood in this room wearing a server's uniform, carrying plates and filling water glasses. I had given up on my dream of being a musician. I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever. She glanced at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. Life doesn't always follow the path we expect, May continued. Sometimes we have to take detours. Sometimes we think we've lost our way completely. But I've learned that true passion doesn't disappear. It waits patiently for us to find our way back. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool, familiar weight beneath her fingers. Tonight I want to share with you the piece that changed my life. 1 year ago, when I played this in this very spot, I thought it was a one-time performance, a momentary return to something I had lost. I had no idea it was actually a beginning. With that, she launched into Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. But unlike a year ago, when she had played it with the rusty technique of someone long out of practice, tonight her performance was polished and confident. Her fingers flew across the keys with precision born of thousands of hours of recent practice. The emotional depth she brought to the piece reflected not just technical mastery, but the journey of the past year, the struggles, the triumphs, the rediscovery of her voice as an artist. As the final chords resonated through the restaurant, the audience erupted in applause far more thunderous than the polite appreciation typical of such venues. May stood and bowed, her eyes finding her grandmother, who was wiping away tears. The evening continued with a carefully selected program of pieces that reflected May's journey, from Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, which she had played at her Juilliard audition years ago, to contemporary pieces she had only recently mastered. Between selections, she shared brief stories about her musical life, connecting with the audience in a way that transformed the restaurant into an intimate concert hall. During a short intermission, May made her way to her grandmother's table. "You played beautifully, little sparrow," her grandmother said, clasping May's hand. "I always knew this day would come." "I wouldn't be here without you," May replied, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "Everything I did for you." Her grandmother shook her head. "No, you put aside what you loved to take care of me. That was your choice, and I am grateful. But this," she gestured toward the piano, "this you are doing for yourself, as it should be." After the intermission, as May returned to the piano for the second half of her program, she was surprised to see Reynolds approaching the piano with a small velvet box. Before May continues, he addressed the audience. "We have a small presentation to make." He turned to May. "When you played here a year ago, you changed not just your own life but the direction of our restaurant. Because of you, Le Chateau is now known as a place where extraordinary talent is discovered and celebrated. We've since launched a monthly showcase for young musicians, many from backgrounds similar to yours." He opened the box to reveal a small golden key. "This is a replica of the key to our piano. The real one will always be available to you, day or night, whenever you want to return to where your journey restarted. You will always have a home at Le Chateau." May accepted the symbolic key with tears in her eyes. She hadn't expected this gesture, and its meaning overwhelmed her. This restaurant had been just a job, a means to an end during the hardest period of her life. Now it represented something entirely different. The bridge between who she had been and who she had become, as she played the final piece of the evening, a delicate Debussy prelude that showcased her newfound confidence in musical interpretation. May reflected on the twists her life had taken. She thought of the countless nights she had served in this very room, invisible to the patrons who now watched her with rapt attention. She thought of the moment she had decided to risk everything by revealing her talent. She thought of all the people who had helped her along the way, Mrs. Wilson with her connections, Professor Abramovich with his patient rebuilding of her technique, Antoine with his blunt but necessary advice. The final notes hung in the air like a question answered. As applause filled the room once more, May looked out at the faces before her, some familiar from her days as staff, others new admirers of her music. In the back, she caught sight of the current waitstaff, watching her with expressions that contained both admiration and perhaps a touch of their own hidden dreams. After several curtain calls, as the formal performance concluded and guests began to mingle, May found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Music students asked for advice, patrons complimented specific passages, and former colleagues shared memories of her waitressing days. Eventually, she made her way back to her grandmother's table, where Mrs. Wilson had joined them. "I have news," Mrs. Wilson said with barely contained excitement. "The foundation board met yesterday. We've decided to establish a scholarship in your name, the Machen Resilience Award. It will cover full tuition and living expenses for talented musicians who have had to interrupt their education due to financial or family hardships." May's hand flew to her mouth. "Are you serious?" "Completely. Your story resonated with so many of our donors. They want to ensure that other young musicians don't have to choose between their art and their family responsibilities." Tears filled May's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help select the recipients," Mrs. Wilson replied. "No one understands better than you what they're going through." As the evening wound down, May found herself once more at the piano. The restaurant had emptied except for staff cleaning up and a few lingering friends. Her fingers moved gently over the keys, not playing anything in particular, just feeling the connection that had been rekindled a year ago. Lena approached, sitting beside her on the bench. "Remember when I caught you airplaying Bach in the break room?" she asked with a grin. May laughed. "You were the first person here who knew my secret, and now the whole world knows." Lena bumped May's shoulder playfully. "I told you that you should play this piano." "You did," May acknowledged. "Thank you for that. So what's next for the great May Chen? More tours? Recording contract?" I heard someone mention a concerto with the Philharmonic. May smiled, her fingers still moving over the keys in quiet patterns. All of that, I hope. But also, she looked around the restaurant thoughtfully. I want to remember where I came from. I want to use whatever platform I have to help others who are struggling like I was. Music gave me a second chance. I want to pay that forward. As the last staff members waved goodbye and headed home, May remained at the piano, playing softly in the empty restaurant. The melody was her own composition, something new she had been working on that told the story of her journey from waitress to concert pianist, from giving up to beginning again. In the quiet of the restaurant where everything had changed, surrounded by the echoes of both her past and future, May played on, no longer invisible, no longer silent, her music filling the space with the sound of dreams reborn.